wasn't expecting anything fancy for Valentine's Day, not after the breakup. So when I matched with Sarah on a dating app a few days earlier, I figured, why not? We texted for a while. She seemed sweet, a little quirky, but her profile was mostly normal. She suggested a small diner downtown, simple, nothing extravagant. But as I walked in, I had this odd feeling in my gut. The place was almost empty for a Friday night, just one other couple in a corner booth. The lights were dim, and the red velvet booths felt a little too plush. I spotted her immediately as Sarah. She was sitting at a corner table, staring down at her phone. Her long black hair fell over her shoulders like a curtain. But something felt off. There was an intensity to her gaze when she finally looked up at me. Too intense, like she was trying to read me or study me. Her eyes lingered, and for a second it felt like time had stopped. She didn't smile when she stood up. She didn't offer a handshake, just a nod, like she already knew who I was. We ordered, but the conversation felt stiff. I asked her about her job, her hobbies, things that normally flowed easily with someone new. But her answers were short, clipped. She kept glancing at her phone, then back at me, as though waiting for something. Waiting for what? I didn't know. As the night dragged on, the restaurant seemed quieter, the staff almost ghostly. No one checked on us, not even to offer a refill. And then Sarah asked something that froze me. Have you ever thought about what happens after death? Her voice was steady, but I could sense an edge there. I laughed it off, trying to brush it aside, but she didn't laugh back, just stared. And then the waitress came over. She handed me my check, but when I glanced down at the total, something was off. It was more than it should have been, by a lot. There was a line at the bottom that said, "Pay for your next life." I looked at Sarah, but she wasn't looking at me anymore. She was staring at something behind me, her lips curling into a thin smile. I turned around. Nothing. The diner was now completely empty. The waitress wasn't even standing behind the counter anymore. I didn't pay the check. I couldn't. My hands were shaking too much, and I could barely get my card out of my wallet. When I looked back at Sarah, her eyes were locked on me again, but her smile was wrong. It was too wide, almost like she was trying to swallow me whole with that look. I stood up quickly, grabbing my jacket, muttering something about needing to get going. I felt a sharp pain in my stomach, like I had eaten something rotten, but I didn't know why. Sarah didn't move. She just stayed sitting there, still staring, and when I turned to leave, I heard her whisper, "You can't leave, you know." I froze. My breath hitched in my chest. I glanced back. She was still sitting there, hands folded neatly in front of her, but now there was something unsettling about her stillness. I bolted out of the diner. The cold air hit my face like a slap, and I was suddenly hyper-aware of every sound, the distant hum of traffic, the sound of my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. I fumbled for my car keys in my pocket, my fingers trembling, and when I finally unlocked my car and climbed inside, I thought I was safe. But as I started the engine, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. It was Sarah. She was standing in the doorway of the diner, still looking at me, her face pressed against the glass. Her smile hadn't faded. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, some weird angle, but then she moved. Slowly, deliberately, she began walking toward my car. My heart pounded in my chest. I threw the car into reverse and sped off, not even looking back, my mind racing. As I turned the corner, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A figure standing in the shadows. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't even a person. It was a tall, thin shape, standing perfectly still, and it was staring directly at my car as I sped past. I couldn't stop shaking. The drive home was a blur. I kept looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting Sarah, or whatever that thing was, to be following me. My pulse hammered in my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, like I was being watched. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I took a long look at the empty street, trying to calm my nerves. But the moment I stepped out of the car, I froze. There was something on the ground in front of my doorstep. It was a red rose, its petals crushed and wilted, but still strangely vibrant against the cold concrete. My first thought was that it was a sick joke, maybe someone playing with me, but then I noticed something else. An envelope nestled under the rose. I didn't want to open it. Something told me that if I did, I'd be inviting whatever had followed me home into my life. But curiosity got the better of me. The envelope was plain, no name, just an odd red wax seal in the shape of a heart. Inside, a single card, no words, just an image of the same diner where I had met Sarah. But the place was different now, darker, decayed, as if time had swallowed it up. The only other thing on the card was a number, scribbled hastily in black ink. I thought about calling the police, but the number felt important, like a clue or a warning. I dialed it. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and then I heard a voice. It was soft at first, almost too quiet to hear, but then it grew clearer. "You should have stayed." I didn't recognize the voice, but it felt like it was right beside me, whispering in my ear. I dropped the phone. My breath hitched and I ran to my front door, slamming it shut behind me. I never went back to that diner. But sometimes I still hear the whispers, and I'm not sure who's really stalking me anymore, Sarah or something else. The weeks following that night were a blur. I couldn't sleep. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should. Every creak of the house made me jump. I didn't leave my apartment much, except to go to work. And even then, I felt like I was always looking over my shoulder. My phone never stopped buzzing, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. The number from the card, the one that whispered to me, kept calling. I didn't recognize the area code, but I knew it was the same voice. One night, I finally picked up. "Why haven't you returned my call?" the voice asked, soft but menacing. My heart pounded. I slammed the phone down, but that night things escalated. It started with strange knocks at the door, soft at first, then louder, relentless. I opened it once, thinking it was a package or a delivery, but there was nothing there, just the cold air and an eerie silence. Then the letters started. Red wax-sealed envelopes, just like the one I'd gotten after the dinner. They came every few days, each one with a different, more decayed image of the diner. Each one with that same number, scrawled in ink. No return address, no name, just the haunting sense that someone knew exactly where I was. The final letter came one night when I was half asleep. It was a small box wrapped tightly with a ribbon. My hands trembled as I opened it, and inside there was a single item, a broken piece of the red wax seal. I felt my blood run cold. A chill ran down my spine as I looked at the broken seal. It was identical to the one on the card, except now it was cracked. Something inside me snapped, and I realized the truth. Sarah hadn't been the threat, she was the bait. I didn't know who or what was really behind this, if it was someone from the diner or something worse. But I knew one thing for sure: they were never going to let me go. It was supposed to be a quiet Valentine's Day. I'd been seeing Catherine for about 6 months, long enough to think I knew her well, but not long enough to feel completely secure. She was sweet, thoughtful, and always seemed to have a smile that lit up any room. So when she asked if I'd be willing to meet her at her apartment that night, I didn't hesitate. We planned a simple evening, dinner, wine, a movie. Nothing out of the ordinary, but when I arrived at her place, something felt off. The hallway outside her apartment was quieter than usual, too quiet. The lights flickered intermittently, casting long, strange shadows that I couldn't shake off. I knocked on her door, but there was no answer. I called her, but the phone rang straight to voicemail. I stood there for a minute, confused. Maybe she was in the bathroom, or just hadn't heard me. But then I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar. It didn't make sense. Catherine was always meticulous about keeping everything locked. I pushed the door open gently, calling her name. No response. The apartment looked normal at first. Her coat hanging on the back of the door, the TV still on in the living room. But as I stepped in, I noticed something else. There were wet footprints on the floor leading from the bathroom toward the living room. I froze. She didn't tell me she was expecting anyone else. I called her name again, louder this time, my heart pounding in my chest. But then, I heard a sound from the other room, a soft creak, like someone had just shifted their weight. I moved toward the sound, my steps cautious, as though the floor might give way beneath me. The creak had come from the kitchen, but as I got closer, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The door was cracked open just a few inches, barely enough to see inside. I gently pushed it open, but the sight in front of me made my blood run cold. Catherine's phone was lying on the kitchen counter, but it was the screen that caught my attention. It was on, showing a message from an unknown number. "I see you." My stomach dropped. I reached for the phone, my hands shaking, but the sound of something scraping against the floor made me snap my head back to the living room. Then I heard it again, a voice, soft, almost a whisper. "I told you not to look." I turned. Standing at the end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. It was Catherine, but something was wrong. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if she was seeing me from behind a fog. Her lips parted, and before I could say anything, she spoke again, her voice an eerie monotone. "You shouldn't have come. He's watching." I stepped back, confused and terrified. I wanted to reach out to her, to hold her, but something was off about the way she was standing, rigid, almost mechanical. Just then I heard a faint noise from behind me. It was a soft click, like a door opening. My heart raced as I spun around. The bathroom door, which had been closed when I arrived, was now wide open, and the dim light inside seemed to flicker, like someone had been moving in there. I backed up slowly, my mind spinning. I had no idea what was happening, but I was sure of one thing. I wasn't alone in the apartment. Panic surged through me. I didn't know whether to run or confront whatever was hiding in the apartment. My feet moved on their own, and before I knew it, I was backing into the hallway, glancing over my shoulder at Catherine. Her vacant expression was still fixed on me, her lips barely moving as she repeated, "He's watching." I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed to the door, my hand fumbling with the doorknob, but as soon as I tried to turn it, it wouldn't budge. I slammed my shoulder into it, the metal feeling cold and unyielding. The air around me felt suffocating. I could hear my breath coming in sharp gasps, and the sound of something shifting behind me sent a jolt of terror through my body. I whipped around. The kitchen was empty now, but the floor was no longer wet. It was covered in handprints. Small, smeared prints, as if someone had been crawling toward me. My eyes darted back to Catherine. She hadn't moved, but there was something more now. A shadow hanging behind her, its outline barely visible, like it was crouching just out of sight, watching. The room seemed to grow darker, and the flickering light from the kitchen made everything look distorted. "Why are you doing this?" I choked out, my voice breaking. Her lips curled into a thin smile, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "He told me to wait for you." Her voice had dropped to a whisper, barely audible. "He's been waiting for a long time." Before I could respond, the shadow behind her seemed to move, a sudden, swift motion like it was sliding out of her body. My breath caught. The figure was tall, thin, its form completely black, almost like a silhouette, but it wasn't solid. I could see through it, as though it was made of smoke or darkness. It stepped forward, and I felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. My teeth were chattering, my hands frozen to my sides. In a blur, it reached for me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I bolted. I turned and ran for the door, pounding my fists against it, yelling for help. But the apartment seemed to stretch on forever, and no matter how much I fought, the door wouldn't open. I heard Catherine's voice again, distant, almost drowned out by the rising sound of something scratching, scraping behind me. "He's here." I kept pounding on the door, the cold, heavy weight of panic flooding my chest. The scraping sound behind me grew louder, closer. I was about to scream when I felt a hand on my shoulder, a cold, clammy touch that froze me in place. I spun around, my eyes wide, but the figure was gone. The hallway was empty. Catherine was still standing there, her body eerily still, and the dark shape behind her had vanished. I felt the tension ease for just a second. Maybe I had imagined it, maybe I had lost my mind. But then I saw something that sent a jolt of terror through me. On the wall near the kitchen, written in what looked like black ink, was a message. "You're mine now." The words burned into my mind as I backed away from the wall. This was no joke. I was trapped in here with whatever was haunting Catherine, whatever had been lurking in the shadows. I turned back to the door again, my hands shaking as I tried to turn the knob. This time, it clicked. It opened. I ran out of that apartment like my life depended on it, not even daring to look back. I didn't know what happened to Catherine or who or what had been in that apartment with her, but I could feel its presence, like it was still lingering in my bones. I called the cops as soon as I got into my car, but when they arrived at the apartment, they found nothing. No sign of Catherine, no strange messages on the walls, just an empty, untouched apartment. I never went back. But weeks later, I saw a news story. Catherine's picture was plastered across the screen, her face pale, eyes wide. The headline read, "Missing woman found dead in her apartment. Cause of death unclear." The investigators couldn't explain it, but they said something strange. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle. I couldn't sleep that night. The more I thought about it, the more I realized the truth. Catherine wasn't the one who had been waiting for me. It was something else. Something that had claimed her. And it was still out there. I thought it would be the perfect Valentine's Day. Emma and I had been dating for over a year, and for some reason, I felt like this was going to be our night. Like everything had aligned for us to make it unforgettable. We decided to rent a small cabin upstate, tucked away in the woods, where we could escape the city and spend some quality time together. The photos online were gorgeous. A cozy fireplace, a hot tub, a small lake just beyond the trees. It was everything I wanted. We drove up in the late afternoon, watching the sunset as we pulled off the main road onto a gravel path that led to the cabin. The drive was long and the air outside was crisp, the trees blackened by the fading light. But when we arrived, I noticed something strange. There were no other cars, no lights in the windows. The place seemed deserted, too quiet for a rented property that was supposed to be part of a small cabin community. Emma noticed it too. She gave me a nervous smile, but I shrugged it off. I had booked the place months ago and I hadn't received any warnings from the host. We opened the door, the creaky hinges protesting as we stepped inside. The cabin had that musty, rustic smell, and the lights flickered to life when I flipped the switch. Emma tossed her bag onto the couch, clearly eager to relax. But as I walked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a weird coldness in the air that didn't match the temperature outside, and the furniture, while rustic, was off in a way I couldn't explain. The couch cushions were too firm. The antique paintings on the wall felt too still. "Are you okay?" Emma asked, pulling me out of my thoughts. She stood by the fireplace, where a few logs were ready to be lit. I nodded, but something inside me said no. We decided to start the evening with a quiet dinner. Emma had brought along a small bottle of wine, and I had prepared some light snacks. But as we settled into the evening, I couldn't shake the eerie sensation that we were being watched. The cabin seemed too empty, too silent, as if it was holding its breath. Emma, as usual, was oblivious to my unease. She was telling me a funny story about her work, laughing as she poured more wine, but I couldn't focus on her words. Every creak of the cabin seemed exaggerated, every shadow in the corners of the room more pronounced. I tried to push it aside. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. But then it happened. The doorbell rang. I froze. No one should have been out here. It was miles from the nearest neighbor, and we hadn't heard any cars. Emma's face shifted from confusion to concern. "Who could that be?" she asked, standing up. "It's getting late." I walked to the door, peering through the small window beside it, but all I saw was darkness. No car in the driveway, no movement in the yard, just the eerie shadows of trees bending in the wind. I opened the door slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. But no one was there, no one at all. I stepped outside, looking around, thinking maybe someone had left quickly, but the driveway was empty. Nothing. Emma was standing behind me, now visibly shaken. "There's no one here," I muttered, the words feeling hollow. I couldn't explain it. Who would come out here just to ring a doorbell and leave? When I turned back to the door, I noticed something. The small, faded card that had been tucked into the cabin's welcome binder was now lying on the doorstep. It was an invitation, a Valentine's Day card, addressed to us. The handwriting was elegant, but the ink was smeared, as if the writer had been in a hurry. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and read the message inside. "You are not alone." I stared at the card in disbelief. "You are not alone." The words seemed to reverberate through the cabin, their meaning sinking into me like ice. I turned to Emma, who was pale, her lips trembling. She had seen the card too, and I could tell she was just as rattled as I was. "This isn't funny," I muttered, trying to laugh it off, but the sound came out hollow. "Someone's messing with us." I walked back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My mind raced. Was this some twisted joke from the cabin host? Maybe it was someone who had been watching us from the woods, or perhaps it was just some sick prankster who knew we were staying there. But nothing made sense. If someone had been out there, why didn't they just show themselves? Why leave a creepy note instead? I glanced at the fireplace. It had been cold all night, but now the fire was burning bright, too bright. I'd barely touched the logs earlier, but somehow the flames were roaring as if they'd been stoked for hours. The warmth in the room was almost suffocating. "Emma," I called, turning to look for her. But the cabin felt oddly empty. I couldn't hear her breathing. There was only the crackling of the fire and the high-pitched hum of something, what sounded like a distant bell ringing. I found her in the corner of the room, staring at the wall with a blank expression, her hands pressed against her ears. She didn't seem to hear me calling her name. I shook her lightly, but she didn't react. That's when I saw it. In the reflection of the window behind her, the shadow of a figure standing just outside. I jumped back, my heart pounding. "Emma!" I shouted, grabbing her by the shoulders. She snapped out of her trance, blinking in confusion, but when she turned to look at the window, there was nothing there. No shadow, no movement. I rushed to the window, my breath fogging up the glass as I pressed my forehead to it. Nothing. The yard was empty again, but the ringing sound, like a bell tolling, was growing louder, closer, until I felt the walls vibrate with it. Suddenly, the doorbell rang again. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. The doorbell rang again. This time, it sounded almost frantic, desperate. I couldn't move, frozen in place by the overwhelming tension in the air. Emma was gripping my arm, her face pale as she whispered, "What the hell is going on?" I turned to her, but she wasn't looking at me. Her gaze was fixed on something just behind me, her eyes wide with fear. I didn't want to turn around, but I had to. I slowly, reluctantly turned my head. There, standing in the corner of the room, was a figure, a woman. Her back was to us, her long hair flowing like a dark waterfall. She was facing the fireplace, but as I stared at her, I realized something chilling. She was completely still, as if frozen in time. "Who is that?" I choked out, my voice barely audible. Emma didn't answer. She was paralyzed, her eyes locked onto the figure, tears welling up in her eyes. "Who is that?" I repeated, louder this time. But Emma just shook her head. She couldn't speak. She was too terrified to do anything but stare. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and touched the woman's shoulder, cold, like ice. The moment I made contact, the figure spun around. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and the blackness in her gaze seemed to pull me in. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Then everything went silent. The fire flickered and the ringing stopped. The air grew still, and it felt like the whole world had held its breath. I took a step back, but the woman didn't move. She just stood there, staring at us with that empty gaze. Suddenly, Emma gasped, her voice breaking. That's the woman. The one from the picture." I turned to her, confused. "What picture?" Emma pointed to the wall, her finger trembling. There, hanging above the fireplace, was a photograph, a black and white image of a woman, her eyes the same empty black voids as the one in front of us. The photo was old, faded, but I knew with a sickening certainty that this was the same woman, the same figure. I backed up, feeling like I was suffocating. I grabbed Emma's arm and yanked her toward the door. We ran out of the cabin without looking back, the door slamming behind us. We didn't stop until we reached the car, and as I drove away, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. The cabin was still there, nestled in the woods, but standing in the window was the woman staring at us with those same empty eyes. When we finally got home, I checked the cabin's listing again. There was no mention of a woman in any of the photos. The reviews didn't say anything about her either. In fact, the host had disappeared after we left, and there was no record of any previous guests. But Emma and I both knew the truth. The woman had been waiting for us. And she wasn't just part of the cabin, she was part of the night. A presence that had been there long before we ever arrived. And I realized something far worse. She wasn't waiting to welcome us. She had been waiting to keep us.